The humidity of the underground parking garage clung to the air like a heavy shroud, smelling of expensive tires and burnt high-octane fuel. Leo Mendez stood perfectly still, his cheap valet vest feeling like a target against the backdrop of the hotel's limestone pillars. He watched as the matte black SUV rolled to a halt, its tinted windows reflecting the dim amber light like obsidian. Mateo, El Halcón Vega stepped out, a man whose name was a death sentence in Chicago, carrying a weight of power that seemed to warp the very space around him. Behind him, 4 guards materialized, silent, tactical shadows with fingers resting near the stocks of their submachine guns. For a microsecond, Leo's 19-year-old frame looked fragile, a child standing before a god of war. Vega's eyes, cold as a desert night, locked onto Leo's. He didn't speak, he simply extended a hand, the silver keys of the luxury supercar dangling like a silver lure. As Leo reached out, his fingers brushed the cold metal, and the 30-year weight of his parents' secrets flared in his mind. He wasn't just taking the car, he was taking the first shot in a war that had waited 3 decades for a witness. The tires of the matte black beast chirped against the polished concrete as Leo Mendez steered it into the secluded VIP sector of the garage. The cabin of the supercar was a sensory overload of wealth. The scent of hand-stitched Italian leather was so thick it felt like it was coating his lungs, and the hum of the precision engine vibrated through the soles of his shoes. To anyone watching the security feeds, he was just a 19-year-old kid doing a job he wasn't paid enough for. But inside, Leo's heart was hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of terror that threatened to choke him. He wasn't just parking a car, he was infiltrating a tomb. He eased the vehicle into a shadow-drenched corner, away from the direct glare of the overhead LED floods. This was the moment. The stop note was a crumpled, yellowed scrap of paper tucked into his palm, slick with his own cold sweat. It carried a word and a specific, jagged symbol that had been burned into his memory since the night his parents disappeared 15 years ago. If Mateo, El Halcón Vega saw this, the 30-year cycle of blood might finally break. If a guard saw it first, Leo wouldn't live to see the sunrise. Leo reached for the latch of the glove box. His fingers felt like leaden weights, clumsy and unresponsive. The mechanism clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire concrete cavern like a gunshot. He froze, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The garage was a labyrinth of silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic dripping of a faulty pipe. He fumbled with the note, trying to wedge it behind a stack of registration papers where it would only be found by someone looking for something specific. Suddenly, the heavy metal door at the end of the corridor groaned open. The sharp, rhythmic clack-clack of tactical boots on concrete shattered the stillness. Leo's blood turned to ice. He didn't have time to close the compartment. He slumped down into the deep bucket seat, trying to make his frame as small as possible, his head ducked below the dash line. Through the gap in the doorframe, he saw the silhouette of a guard, a mountain of a man with a scarred neck and an assault rifle slung over his shoulder. The beam of a high-powered tactical flashlight began to sweep the area, its white light cutting through the shadows like a blade. The guard was moving closer. Each footfall sounded like a death knell. The light danced across the hood of the car, then the windshield, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Leo squeezed his eyes shut, his hand still resting inches away from the open glove box. He could hear the low, static-filled murmur of the guard's comms unit. The man was suspicious. He had noticed the car was still running, the engine's low growl a beacon in the quiet. The shadow of the guard loomed over the driver's side window. Leo could hear the heavy, slow breathing of the hunter. The light began to probe the interior. It swept over the steering wheel, the leather dash, and started to move toward the open compartment. Leo's lungs burned. He hadn't taken a breath in nearly a minute. He felt the urge to bolt, to scream, to throw himself at the man and hope for a quick end. Then, a sudden crackle from the guard's radio broke the tension. Sector 4. We have a delivery at the service entrance. Vega wants the perimeter tightened. The guard paused, the light hovering just inches from the yellowed edge of the note. For an eternity, the beam stayed fixed, dissecting the darkness. Then, with a grunt of annoyance, the man clicked the light off. The heavy footsteps receded, moving back toward the entrance. Leo waited until the heavy door thudded shut before he finally let out a jagged, trembling breath. With shaking hands, he shoved the note deep into the crevice, snapped the glove box shut, and wiped his fingerprints from the latch. He stepped out of the car, his legs feeling like water, and vanished into the shadows of the valet booth. The gamble was placed. The ghost of his father's secret was now in the hands of a monster. The heavy, armored door of the sedan closed with a pressurized thud, sealing Mateo Vega into a world of climate-controlled silence and the scent of expensive dead things. He pulled away from the hotel curb, the city of Chicago a blur of neon through the thick, bulletproof glass. For 30 years, Vega had been the architect of silence, building an empire on the corpses of those who spoke too much or knew too little. His power was absolute, rooted in the terror of his name and the ironclad belief that no one alive remembered the nights before the war began. He adjusted the steering wheel, feeling the precision of the machine, but as he reached for a pack of cigarettes, he kept tucked in the glove box. The equilibrium of his world shifted. The latch clicked open, and the small interior light of the compartment spilled onto a stack of pristine documents. Wedged between the leather-bound manual and the vehicle's registration was a scrap of paper that didn't belong. It was yellowed, the edges frayed as if it had been carried through a fire. Vega pulled it out, his movements slow and deliberate. As his eyes fell upon the word "stop" written in that jagged, unmistakable hand, the air in the cabin suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen had been sucked out by a vacuum. Beneath the word was the symbol, a fractured hawk entwined with a broken olive branch. It was the sigil of the Mendez peacebrokers, a sigil that had been wiped from the face of the earth 15 years ago on a rainy night in a suburban driveway. Vega's heart, a muscle he had long ago hardened into a stone, gave a violent, painful thrum. This wasn't just a note. It was a ghost reaching out from a shallow grave to wrap its fingers around his throat. He slowed the car, the high-performance engine idling with a low, predatory growl as he pulled into a dark turnout overlooking the river. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Someone was alive. Someone knew the truth about the night the truce was shattered. For 3 decades, the war between the Vega and Moretti syndicates had turned the streets red, fueled by the lie that the Mendez family had betrayed them both. Vega himself had used that lie to seize the throne, whispering it into the ears of his lieutenants until it became gospel. But this paper, this impossible scrap of history, was proof that a witness remained, a phantom who knew that Vega hadn't been a victim of the betrayal, but its author. He stared at the handwriting. It was too precise, too hauntingly familiar. It looked exactly like the script of the man he had personally executed to ensure the war never ended. He felt a bead of cold sweat track down his spine, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a foot soldier in the slums. His mind raced through the events of the last hour. He had arrived at the hotel, handed his keys to a boy, a valet with eyes that were too large for his face. He tried to recall the kid's features, but they were a blur of youth and anonymity. Vega gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned under the pressure. The phantom witness wasn't just a threat to his business. They were a threat to the very foundation of his reality. If the word got out, if the symbol was shown to the Moretti family, the 30-year war wouldn't just end. It would turn into a unified crusade against him. Every soldier he commanded, every ally he had bought, would turn their blades toward the man who had tricked them into killing their own brothers for a generation. He looked at the note again, the word "stop" appearing less like a plea and more like an ultimatum. The silence of the car was now a cage. He wasn't the hunter anymore. He was being watched by someone who moved in the shadows of his own infrastructure. He reached for his encrypted phone, his fingers hovering over the dial for his head of security. He needed to find that valet. He needed to know if the boy was the messenger or the message itself. As he shifted the car back into gear, the tires screaming against the asphalt, Mateo Vega realized that the invisible life he had built atop a mountain of lies was finally beginning to crumble. The war hadn't ended yet, but the peace of the grave was no longer guaranteed. The adrenaline that had sustained Leo through the encounter in the garage was beginning to sour. turning into a cold, leaden weight in the pit of his stomach. He stood in the small, glass-walled valet booth, his hands tucked deep into the pockets of his uniform to hide the uncontrollable tremors. Outside, the night air of Chicago was thick with the scent of impending rain and the relentless hum of a city that never slept. He tried to focus on the logbook, but his eyes kept darting to the bank of monitors behind the front desk. On the screen for Sector 4, he saw a familiar silhouette, the mountain of a man with the scarred neck, standing exactly where the supercar had been parked. The guard wasn't moving. He was staring directly at the security camera, his radio pressed to his lips. Leo felt the air leave his lungs. He knew the protocol for men like that. They didn't wait for proof. They acted on suspicion, and suspicion was a death sentence when it involved Mateo Vega's property. He looked at the digital clock on the desk, 11:42 p.m. His shift ended at midnight, but the vultures wouldn't wait 18 minutes. He saw a second guard enter the frame on the monitor, pointing toward the valet booth. The game of invisibility was over. The note had been found, or the act of planting it had been witnessed on a digital loop he couldn't erase. He was no longer a ghost. He was a target. He didn't grab his bag. He didn't even stop to punch out. He slipped out of the side door of the valet booth, just as a black SUV with darkened windows screeched to a halt at the hotel's main entrance. He didn't look back to see the men in tactical vests stepping out. He already knew the sound of their boots. Leo ducked into the narrow service alley that ran between the hotel and a shuttered department store, his feet silent on the damp pavement. The transition from the luxury of the lobby to the grime of the alley was instantaneous, a reflection of how quickly his life had just derailed. He ran with a desperate, focused energy, weaving through the labyrinth of dumpsters and steam vents. He knew every shortcut, every blind spot in the city's surveillance grid, knowledge he had cultivated during years of staying beneath the radar. But the syndicate owned the grid. As he emerged onto a side street, he saw the sweep of a spotlight from a low-flying drone overhead. They weren't just looking for him, they were cordoning him off. The realization that Vega would mobilize this much hardware for a single valet confirmed Leo's deepest fear. The note hadn't just bothered the boss, it had terrified him. The city, once his sanctuary, was now a predatory landscape. Every headlight's beam felt like a searching eye. Every distant siren was a countdown. He reached the entrance to the L train station at Staten Lake, his breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. He needed to disappear into the crowd, but at this hour, the platform was a desolate stage. He vaulted over the turnstile, ignoring the startled look of the booth attendant, and sprinted down the stairs toward the red line. He could hear the heavy thud of footsteps following him, too fast and too synchronized to be commuters. They were closing the gap. He reached the platform just as the rhythmic screech of the train echoed through the tunnel. The wind pushed a wall of stale, hot air ahead of the lead car. Leo stood at the very edge of the yellow tactile strip, his heart a frantic bird trapped in his chest. He saw the vultures emerge at the top of the stairs, their hands reaching inside their jackets. They didn't care about witnesses. They didn't care about the cameras. They only cared about the boy who knew the word and the symbol. The doors hissed open. Leo stepped in, his eyes locked on the guards who were now sprinting down the platform. Just as the chimes sounded and the doors began to slide shut, he saw the scarred man reach the glass. The guard's fist slammed against the window, his face a mask of thwarted rage. As the train lurched forward, pulling Leo into the darkness of the tunnel, he slumped against the door. He had escaped the hotel, but he had traded the cage of the garage for a citywide trap. He was a 19-year-old boy with no home, no allies, and a 30-year war strapped to his back. The city was a maze, and the Minotaur was now fully awake. The rhythmic rattling of the Red Line train into the deep, subterranean tunnels of Chicago acted as a metronome, pulling Leo Mendez's consciousness away from the cold plastic seat and back into the sweltering, rain-slicked memory of 15 years ago. Before he was an invisible valet, he was a child who lived in a house filled with heavy whispers and the constant, clicking sound of pens on paper. His parents, Elena and Julian Mendez, were not warriors, but they were the only people both Mateo Vega and the Moretti family feared. They were the architects of the Great Truce, the silent mediators who held the city together by the sheer force of their integrity. In a world of predators, they were the high wire act, maintaining a balance that had kept the 30-year war in a state of fragile dormancy. Leo remembered a night where the air felt like static before a storm. He had been hiding under the heavy mahogany dining table, playing with a toy car, while his parents sat across from a man who had yet to become El Halcón. Julian Mendez had been leaning forward, his voice a steady, calm anchor as he presented a document, the same one Leo had just recreated as a note. It bore the sigil of the fractured hawk and the olive branch, a symbol of a unified Chicago. His father had been explaining that the betrayal everyone feared wasn't coming from the rival syndicates, but from a third party, a hidden parasite within their own ranks that was profiting from the chaos of conflict. Julian had discovered that a high-ranking lieutenant was skimming from the war funds and intentionally leaking shipment routes to keep the families at each other's throats. As Julian slid the evidence across the table, Leo saw the flash of recognition in the young Mateo Vega's eyes. It wasn't the look of a man who wanted peace. It was the look of a man who realized that the truth was more dangerous to his ambitions than the war ever was. If the families realized they were being manipulated by an outsider, Julian and Elena would be hailed as heroes, and the power vacuum Vega hoped to fill would vanish. The memory shifted to the suburban driveway, the smell of wet asphalt, and the blinding glare of high beams. Leo had been in the back seat of the family sedan, watching through a gap in the seat as Julian and Elena were forced out of the car. He remembered his father's last gesture, tucking his thumb into his palm and tapping his index finger twice against his leg, the same silent signal Leo had seen in the stories of the old streets, a plea for Leo to stay quiet, to stay invisible. Then came the stop command, barked not by a guard, but by the third party, the traitor who had orchestrated the hit to ensure the evidence died with the brokers. The gunshot was a sound that had echoed in Leo's ears for 15 years. He watched as the document Julian had fought for was ripped into pieces and left to soak in the gutter. The third party hadn't just killed his parents. They had used the murder as the ultimate spark to reignite the war, telling the Vegas that the Morettis did it, and telling the Morettis the Vegas had struck first. Mateo Vega had stood by, watching the blood pool in the rain, and in that moment, he had chosen the lie over the legacy. He took the throne, built on a foundation of Julian Mendez's shattered peace, and allowed the 30-year war to become his greatest asset. Now, as the L train screeched around a sharp bend, Leo opened his eyes. The stop note he had left in the glove box wasn't just a request, it was the ghost of that night coming for its due. He realized now that his father hadn't just been a broker, he had been a guardian of a truth so potent it could turn the entire city against its current masters. Leo was no longer just a valet running for his life. He was the final piece of a 30-year puzzle. The blood on the driveway hadn't dried. It had merely been waiting for him to find his voice. He wasn't a child under a table anymore. He was the witness Julian Mendez had sacrificed everything to protect. The screeched halt of the Red Line train at an unscheduled stop deep beneath the loop was the first sign that the world above had been paralyzed. Mateo Vega didn't just have influence. He had the kind of reach that could turn a public utility into a private trap. The lights in the subway car flickered, hummed, and then died, leaving Leo in a tomb of shadows and the smell of ozone. A hollow voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a security emergency and ordering all passengers to remain seated, but Leo knew better. He had seen the vultures on the platform. He knew that every second he spent sitting still was a second closer to a silent execution. He pried the manual emergency lever, the hiss of the doors sounding like a dying gasp in the tunnel's silence, and stepped out into the damp, lightless void of the tracks. Behind him, the city's infrastructure was being weaponized. Vega had initiated a full district lockdown, a digital and physical dragnet designed to squeeze the life out of the downtown corridors until the Valet was found. Above ground, cell towers were being throttled to prevent communication, and every intersection was being patrolled by blacked-out SUVs that ignored the laws of the road. But down here, in the intestines of the city, the hunt was more primal. Leo moved through the darkness, his hand trailing against the soot-caked brick of the tunnel wall, his heart a frantic, uneven rhythm. He wasn't just running from men with guns. He was running from a man who had realized that his 30-year empire was built on a foundation of sand. The tunnels were a labyrinth of forgotten history, a network of service corridors and abandoned freight lines that predated the skyscrapers above. Leo found himself in a disused section of the old Chicago Tunnel Company system, a place where the air was thick with the scent of wet coal and the silence was so heavy it felt physical. He could hear the distant, rhythmic thud of tactical boots echoing through the ventilation shafts. They were moving in a grid pattern, using thermal scanners to dissect the darkness. Every time a beam of white light swept through a distant archway, Leo squeezed himself into the narrowest crevices, pressing his face against the cold, damp stone, praying that his 19-year-old body could become as invisible as the ghosts his parents had become. He reached a junction where the tunnel floor was flooded with stagnant, ankle-deep water. The surface rippled with the vibration of a passing train on the active tracks nearby, a reminder of the world that was moving on without him. He was trapped. The exit he had aimed for, a service ladder leading to a back alley near Wacker Drive, was guarded by two men in tactical gear, their silhouettes framed by the dim amber glow of the street above. They weren't looking for a criminal. They were looking for a boy who carried a piece of paper that could end a war. Leo retreated into the shadows, his mind racing. He had spent his life staying out of the way, being the kid who parked the cars and faded into the background. Now, that invisibility was his only weapon, but the cage was getting smaller. As he crouched behind a rusted iron pillar, he realized that Vega's desperation was his only leverage. If the boss was willing to shut down a major city district for a valet, it meant the note had done more than just bother him. It had confirmed his greatest fear. The 30-year war was a lie, and the truth was a contagion that Vega couldn't allow to spread. Leo reached into his pocket and touched the frayed edges of the original document his father had given him, a relic he had kept hidden for 15 years. He wasn't just a witness, he was a walking ultimatum. The hunt was no longer about a valet who knew too much. It was about the legacy of Julian and Elena Mendez finally demanding a seat at the table. Leo saw a narrow vertical shaft used for electrical cabling. It was a tight squeeze, even for him, but it led upward, bypassing the guarded ladder. He began to climb, the cold metal biting into his palms, the sound of the vultures' search dogs barking in the tunnel below. Every inch he gained was a defiance of the lockdown. He was a 19-year-old boy in a city-wide trap, but he was also the only person in Chicago who knew exactly how to make Mateo Vega's world burn. The hunt had begun, but the prey was no longer just running. He was climbing toward the light of a truth that had waited 30 years to be told. The cold, damp air of the electrical shaft finally gave way to the sterile, pressurized atmosphere of a private penthouse garage. Leo Mendez pulled himself onto the polished floor, his breath hitching in the sudden silence. He didn't have time to orient himself before the click of a safety being disengaged echoed through the hollow space. Mateo Vega stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, the silhouette of El Halcón looking more like a vengeful spirit than a man. The high-powered tactical lights of the garage flared to life, pinning Leo in a blinding crossfire of white light. Vega was alone, his vultures stationed at the perimeter, his expensive suit pristine despite the chaos he had unleashed upon the city to find this single, 19-year-old boy. Leo stood his ground, his knees shaking, but his chin tilted upward. He looked at the man who had occupied the throne of a 30-year war, a man who had stood by and watched Leo's parents die in a rain-slicked driveway. Vega didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he held the yellowed stop note between two gloved fingers, the paper trembling slightly in the recycled air. The silence was heavy, thick with the unsaid history of a generation. Vega stepped into the light, his eyes not filled with the predatory hunger Leo expected, but with a raw, agonizing confusion that bordered on terror. He looked at the sigil on the paper, the fractured hawk and the broken olive branch, and then back at Leo's face, searching for a ghost he thought he had buried 15 years ago. "Where did you get this?" Vega's voice was a low, jagged rasp, stripped of its usual corporate authority. It was the sound of a man watching his foundation crumble. He didn't ask what it was. He knew exactly what it was. He wanted to know how a valet, a boy who should have been a nameless statistic in the foster system, was carrying the physical proof of a truth that could end his world. Vega moved closer, the barrel of his gun lowered, but his presence overwhelming. This was destroyed. I watched it burn in the gutter. I watched the man who wrote it take his last breath. You shouldn't exist, and this certainly shouldn't exist. Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out the original, frayed document his father had given him before the end, the piece he had spent a decade protecting. He held it up, a mirror to the note Vega was clutching. My father didn't just give you a choice 30 years ago, Mateo. He gave me a mission, Leo said, his voice finding a steady, crystalline clarity. He knew you were the author of the betrayal. He knew you were the one skimming from the war funds, playing both families like instruments in a symphony of blood. You didn't kill the brokers to protect the families. You killed them to protect your profit. Vega froze, the revelation hitting him with more force than any bullet. He looked at the second document, the handwriting of Leo Mendez staring back at him with the weight of an eternal accusation. He hadn't just been found out, he had been trapped. For 30 years, he had told himself the lie was necessary for survival, that the war was the only way to keep the city under his thumb. But seeing the symbol and the boy together, he realized that the phantom witness wasn't a rival syndicate or a mole in his ranks. It was the legacy of the truth itself. I should kill you right here, Vega whispered, though the conviction was gone from his eyes. I should bury you in the same silence I gave your parents. He stepped within inches of Leo, the heat of his rage palpable. Give me one reason why I shouldn't end this 30-year war by ending the last Mendez. Leo didn't flinch. He looked directly into the icy blue eyes of the monster. Because the note in your hand isn't the only one, Leo replied, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. I've spent 15 years learning how to be invisible, Mateo. I've learned how to place messages in places you can't reach. If I don't walk out of here, the Moretti family gets the full ledger of your skimming operations within the hour. The war won't just end, it will turn into a unified execution. You didn't find me because you're the hunter. You found me because I wanted to see if you were still human enough to confess. The gun in Vega's hand finally lowered. The cartel boss looked down at the note, the word stop appearing less like a plea and more like a final sentence. The secret meeting wasn't an interrogation, it was a surrender. Vega realized that the boy wasn't looking for mercy. He was holding the keys to the kingdom, and the locks were already turning. The 30-year war had finally met its master, and he was wearing a valet's vest. The silence of the penthouse garage was no longer the silence of a tomb, but the heavy, charged stillness of a turning tide. Mateo Vega looked down at the frayed document Leo held, then back at the yellowed note in his own hand, his sharp angles and shadowed stubble illuminated by the unforgiving tactical lights. The jagged symbol of the fractured hawk and olive branch seemed to pulse under his gaze, but it was the hidden code within the stop message, a series of microscopic needle pricks forming a secondary pattern, that finally shattered his icy blue composure. For 30 years, Vega had operated under the belief that he was the architect of his own destiny, the ruthless boss who had seized the throne by outsmarting the Mendez brokers. Now, the code revealed a deeper rot. The skims and the leaks weren't just his doing. They had been facilitated by the very man standing at his shoulder for 3 decades, his head of security, the scarred vulture who had been the shadow in every room. The elevator chimed, a sharp metallic sound that signaled the arrival of the unified vulture's detail. But they weren't alone. From the service entrance emerged a second group of tactical shadows, led by a man whose face was a mirror image of Vega's wariness, Gianni Moretti. The 2 syndicate heads, who had spent 30 years trying to erase each other from the Chicago skyline, now stood 10 feet apart, separated only by a 19-year-old boy in a valet vest. Leo stood as the bridge between 2 empires of ash, the legacy of Julian and Elena Mendez finally manifesting in the light. Mateo, Moretti began, his voice a low rumble that matched the mechanical hum of the garage. "I received the ledger. The digital ghost told me to look for the needle marks." He held up his own copy of the Mendez sigil, his eyes moving from the paper to the scarred security chief standing behind Vega. The chief's hand moved toward his sidearm, but the movement was sluggish compared to the weight of the realization in the room. He had been the third party all along, the parasite who had whispered lies into both ears, ensuring the war never ended, so his own influence could never be challenged. Mateo Vega didn't look at his lieutenant. He looked at Leo. The icy blue eyes that had dissected the city for a generation were now filled with a devastating clarity. He realized that the Valet wasn't the threat. He was the cure. The 30-year war hadn't been a battle for territory. It had been a long, slow suicide pact orchestrated by a man who lived in their shadows. "My father didn't just want a ceasefire," Leo said, his voice a crystalline anchor that commanded the attention of every armed man in the room. "He wanted a unified Chicago. He wanted you to realize that the enemy wasn't the man across the street, but the man holding your coat." The scarred chief didn't wait for a trial. He lunged for Leo, but he was met by a rare, synchronized response. Vega and Moretti, the two heads of the warring families, moved as one. A single, deafening crack echoed through the garage, and the man who had fueled 30 years of blood with his whispers fell onto the polished concrete. The parasitic cycle was broken. The vultures stood down, their tactical loyalty shifting not to a new boss, but to the undeniable truth that had been unburied by a scrap of paper in a glove box. Leo watched as the two titans of the underworld finally lowered their weapons. They didn't shake hands. There was too much blood for that, but they exchanged a nod that carried the weight of a final ceasefire. The district lockdown was lifted. The drones returned to their nests, and the sirens of the city above faded into a peaceful hum. The 30-year war was over, ended by a 19-year-old boy who had spent his life learning how to be invisible, only to realize that the loudest revolutions are the ones that start in the shadows. As the garage doors opened to the first rays of a Chicago sunrise, Leo walked toward the exit. Mateo Vega watched him go, clutching the note that had rewritten his destiny. Leo Mendez was no longer just the valet who parked the cars. He was the ghost who had finally brought the city home. He stepped out into the cool morning air, the invisible weight finally lifted from his shoulders. He had finished his father's mission. He had found his voice, and in doing so, he had silenced the guns of a generation. The war was dead, and for the first time in 15 years, the son of the brokers was finally free. The overarching lesson across these stories is that true power often resides in those the world considers invisible. Whether it is an anonymous driver or a young valet, these protagonists demonstrate that silence and observation are formidable tools for justice. The key lessons in the story: 1. The power of one small act. A single hand gesture or a lone note in a glove box can dismantle a global syndicate or end a 30-year war. These stories teach that no individual is too small to trigger a massive systemic shift. 2. The danger of digital reliance. The stories highlight a digital trap where technology is weaponized for surveillance. The lesson is that analog skills, human intuition, physical memory, and mechanical mastery are the only ways to bypass a compromised system. 3. Legacy as a responsibility. Both Kenji and Leo are driven by past failures or family secrets. The narrative suggests that honoring one's history requires stepping out of the shadows and turning a ghost of service into an active shield for others. 4. Truth is an unstoppable force. Even the most powerful empires built on lies, like Omnicorp or Vega's Cartel, are structurally fragile. Once the truth is exposed to the public, the vultures and corrupt systems lose their ability to operate in the dark. If you believe that the smallest voice can end the biggest wars, don't let the grid shut us down. Every like is a signal to the system, and every subscription ensures that the next chapter reaches those who need to hear it. Hit that subscribe button and join the resistance. Don't just watch the story, become the witness.